Don't look at him like that. Know your place." The voice was smooth, practiced, cruel. Tatum froze mid-step, the tray trembling in her hands. The woman who spoke, Vanessa, didn't even glance her way again. But Landon did. His jaw clenched. His pulse betrayed him. Because for weeks he'd been trying not to see the kindness in Tatum's eyes, the quiet strength in her silence. He'd built an empire on control, yet one look from her had undone him. He could have stopped it there. Should have. But some truths refused to stay hidden. By the time the storm rolled in that night, the house wasn't the only thing breaking open. Stay with us, because sometimes the heart betrays the silence we build around it, and love finds its way through the walls we swore would keep it out. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever tried to bury your feelings, only to realize they were already too deep to hide? The Harrington estate rose against the gray morning like a monument too proud to age, its glass walls reflecting the restless sea below, its marble floors still holding the echoes of a family long gone. Landon Harrington preferred it that way, silent, polished, predictable. He lived as though every hour were an appointment with solitude, his days mapped out in sleek precision, coffee at 6, calls at 8, nothing spontaneous, nothing messy. Even his grief was curated, tucked behind the tailored lines of his charcoal suits and the monotone hum of the house staff who knew better than to linger. Tatum Wells arrived just after dawn, clutching a small suitcase and a letter from the agency. Her shoes left faint marks on the marble before she realized she was holding her breath. The house was unlike anything she'd ever seen, museum-like, cold, immaculate, a place that looked alive but didn't feel it. When Landon appeared at the top of the staircase, she almost mistook him for part of the decor. He descended slowly, posture straight, his expression unreadable, not cruel, just distant, the kind of distance that comes from too much money and too little warmth. "Tatum Wells, sir." From Harrington staffing. Her voice was steady, practiced, respectful. He nodded once, eyes flicking over her like a signature he didn't remember signing. "Mrs. Doyle will show you the routines. I don't like disruptions." And that was it. No handshake, no welcome, just a dismissal disguised as efficiency. But Tatum wasn't easily rattled. She'd worked for people like him before, people who wore grief like armor and arrogance like perfume. As the day passed, she moved through his world with quiet precision, dusting the library shelves, pressing linen, aligning silverware with mathematical perfection. She noticed things he probably hadn't in years, the faint smudge on a window pane, the vase that tilted ever so slightly toward the light. She hummed softly as she worked, low and rich, a melody from her grandmother's porch back home. Upstairs, in his study, Landon paused mid-email. The sound carried faintly through the vents, curling into the corners of his silence. He told himself it was nothing, just noise. Yet when it stopped, he found himself waiting for it to start again. That night, he passed her in the hallway without meaning to. She stepped aside, head slightly bowed, but her eyes met his, steady, unflinching, curious. Something flickered between them, brief as candlelight. Then she turned away, disappearing into the dim glow of the servants' wing. Landon lingered a moment longer than necessary. He didn't know why. But for the first time in months, the house didn't feel entirely empty. The days slipped into rhythm. Quiet mornings marked by the faint scent of polish and lemon oil, evenings fading into the hush of the sea below the cliffs. Tatum kept to her tasks with disciplined grace, folding the same linens, dusting the same portraits, her hands steady even when her mind wandered elsewhere. To hospital corridors, to bills stacked like unspoken fears, to her mother's fading smile. The Harrington estate offered her no warmth, but it offered a paycheck, and that was enough, or so she kept telling herself. Landon watched her without meaning to. He'd catch glimpses, a reflection in the glass, the swish of a broom, the steady rhythm of her steps down the hall. She was precise, like him, but softer somehow. When she moved, the rooms breathed differently. The air felt less rehearsed. Once, passing by the music room, he heard her humming again, deep and steady, the kind of sound that found its way under the skin. It startled him, that sound, in the same way a memory does when it resurfaces uninvited. He lingered in the doorway, unseen as she wiped the piano keys with a care that bordered on reverence. The melody she hummed didn't belong to this house. It was too human, too alive. He wanted to ask what song it was, but the words refused to cross the distance between them. Instead, he cleared his throat quietly. She straightened, startled, her eyes wide for a moment before she lowered them. "Mr. Harrington," she said softly, her voice calm despite the sudden tension. He nodded, his tone even. "You play?" A pause. "A little." Not well. Her humility wasn't performative. It was disarming. Landon felt it in the small shift of his chest, a discomfort he couldn't quite name. "Carry on," he said, though she was already moving to leave. After she disappeared down the hall, he sat at the piano, pressing a single key. The note hung in the air, lonely, fragile, and he realized how long it had been since music had touched these walls. That night, over a half-finished drink, he tried to dismiss it all. She was an employee, efficient, professional, replaceable. Yet when he closed his eyes, it wasn't the silence of his mansion that echoed. It was her voice, faint and full of life, threading through the emptiness like a heartbeat he'd forgotten he still had. And though he told himself it was nothing, Landon Harrington, who prided himself on control, found himself waiting for morning. The evening had fallen heavy over Waverly Hill, clouds dragging across the sea like bruises. Inside, the dining room glowed under soft chandelier light. Too much elegance for one man, too much silence for anyone else. Tatum moved carefully, her reflection ghosting across the polished marble as she wiped away invisible dust. The house demanded perfection, and she gave it, even when her hands ached from the day's work. She reached for one of the crystal wine glasses near the edge of the table, her grip slipping on the cloth. The glass spun, then shattered against the floor, sharp and sudden as thunder. Landon appeared in the doorway almost instantly, drawn by the sound. His eyes flicked to the mess, his jaw tightening. "Leave it," he said, his voice low, measured, clipped in that way that carried warning more than anger. But Tatum was already kneeling, gathering the shards into her palm, ignoring the sting. "It's fine," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It's not fine," he said, stepping closer. There was irritation in his tone, but beneath it, something else. Concern, maybe. Something he didn't want to name. When she reached for another piece, a bead of blood bloomed against her skin, red against brown. He caught her wrist before she could flinch. The touch stopped everything, the quiet hum of the lights, the sound of the waves below, even her breath. His fingers were warm, firm, careful. She looked up. Their eyes met. For the first time, neither looked away. The world seemed to tilt slightly, as if the house itself leaned in to listen. Tatum's heart pounded, but she stayed still, watching him watch her. His eyes no longer distant, but searching, conflicted. He released her hand slowly, almost reluctantly, and turned toward the sideboard to retrieve a napkin. "You should be more careful," he said, softer now, his back still to her. She smiled faintly, pressing the cloth to her hand. "You should let people help you," she replied, and though her tone was light, something about the words lingered. He looked over his shoulder, caught off guard by her boldness. Then, without another word, he left the room. When the echo of his footsteps faded, Tatum exhaled, realizing her pulse was still racing. She finished sweeping the glass into the bin, her hands trembling slightly. Upstairs, Landon sat in his study, staring at nothing, remembering the feel of her skin beneath his hand, and wondering why it didn't feel like a mistake. The rain arrived like a dare, sheets of water crashing against the glass walls, thunder curling around the cliffs until the whole estate seemed to tremble. Landon stood by the window of his study, watching the storm swallow the horizon. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving only the fractured glow of lightning to outline the room. For the first time in years, silence didn't comfort him. It felt too close, too alive. He moved through the halls by memory, his footsteps echoing off marble, calling out once for Mrs. Doyle, forgetting she'd already left for the night. A flash of movement in the courtyard caught his eye. A figure sprinting through the rain, hair plastered to her face, pulling at the shutters that banged wildly in the wind. Tatum. Before he could think, he was at the door, shouting over the downpour. "Leave them!" But she didn't. She fought the wind until the latch caught, then turned, soaked through, her uniform clinging to her like second skin. When she stepped inside, dripping onto the marble, she laughed breathlessly. "Didn't want your antique windows ending up in the ocean," she said, wiping rain from her cheeks. Her laugh startled him. Not its sound, but the warmth of it, the way it cracked through the tension like sunlight through clouds. He found a towel and handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers just briefly. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, wrapping the towel around her shoulders, her voice softer now. "But someone had to." They found themselves in the kitchen, the only room that still felt human when the power failed. Candles flickered across the countertops, their flames reflected in the glass jars lined neatly along the walls. Landon brewed tea, his movements awkward, as though remembering an old ritual. She sat across from him, barefoot, rain still dripping from the ends of her braid. They talked, or tried to. At first, it was small things, her hometown, his habit of keeping the house at exactly 21 degrees. Then, something shifted. She told him about her mother, the hospital, the nights she worked double shifts to cover the bills. He listened, really listened, for the first time in years. Somewhere between her words, he laughed, quietly, unguarded, almost startled by the sound. When the storm finally broke, they sat in silence, watching the candles burn low. The air felt different now, not storm-heavy, but alive. Neither of them moved to leave. Neither of them wanted to. The morning after the storm, the house smelled faintly of rain and salt, the kind of freshness that made everything feel momentarily forgiven. Tatum moved through the quiet halls, opening curtains, restoring order. The world outside shimmered in washed light, the sea calm again. She reached Landon's study last, a room she approached with quiet respect, where the air always carried the weight of restraint. Everything was precise, the lined-up pens, the sharp symmetry of frames on the walls. But as she dusted the shelf behind his desk, one photograph caught her eye. It was small, worn at the edges, its silver frame less ornate than the others. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, barefoot in the grass, his grin so unguarded it almost hurt to look at. Beside him stood a woman, black, middle-aged, wearing a caretaker's uniform, her arm resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. The tenderness between them was unmistakable, the kind of love that didn't need explanation. Tatum froze, her hand hovering over the frame. "You found her," Landon said from behind her. She startled, turning too quickly, the feather duster slipping from her grasp. He was standing in the doorway, no tie, shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking softer than she had ever seen him. She opened her mouth to apologize, but he shook his head. "It's all right," he said quietly, crossing the room. "That's Miriam." His gaze lingered on the photograph. "She was my mother's housekeeper. But she was more than that. She raised me." Tatum watched his expression change as he spoke, his eyes distant, voice thinner around the edges. He traced the corner of the frame with one finger, almost absently. "She used to hum while she worked," he said after a moment, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Different songs every day." The house felt alive then. Tatum felt a knot form in her chest. She wanted to say something comforting, but words felt clumsy next to the quiet between them. So she just nodded, her eyes soft. "She sounds like she was special." "She was," he replied simply. Then, after a pause, "You remind me of her sometimes." The air seemed to shift, stretching taut between them. She didn't know whether to thank him or step back, so she did neither. He cleared his throat, retreating toward the doorway. "I have a call," he murmured, though his voice sounded far away. When he was gone, Tatum lingered a moment longer, staring at the photograph. She hadn't meant to see that part of him, the boy behind the man. But now that she had, she couldn't unsee it. Upstairs, Landon stood still, the image of her holding that photo burning into his thoughts, unsettling him more than he cared to admit. The knock came just before dusk, firm and entitled, the kind that didn't wait for an answer. Tatum was in the foyer, arranging fresh lilies when the door opened to reveal a woman who didn't need an introduction. Vanessa Beaumont. Her presence filled the space like perfume, expensive, invasive, impossible to ignore. Golden hair fell in glossy waves around a flawless face, lips painted the color of danger. "You must be staff," she said, her tone floating somewhere between politeness and pity. Tatum stepped aside, schooling her expression into composure. "Mr. Harrington's expecting you." "Of course he is." Vanessa's heels clicked across the marble like punctuation marks. Moments later, Landon appeared at the top of the staircase, expression unreadable. "Vanessa," he said, and the way her name left his mouth, flat, measured, told Tatum everything. Dinner unfolded beneath chandeliers that burned too brightly. The table glittered with silver and crystal, every detail immaculate, but the air was thick with something unspoken. Vanessa laughed too loudly, her hand brushing Landon's arm like a claim. Tatum moved through the room quietly, refilling glasses, clearing plates, keeping her eyes on the details that couldn't look back. But Vanessa watched her, every step, every word not said. "So," Vanessa began, her voice dripping sugar, "how lovely it must be to work in such a grand house. Do you ever get lost?" Tatum looked up, steady. "Not anymore, ma'am." Landon's knife paused mid-cut. The smallest flicker crossed his face, something like pride. Vanessa caught it. Her smile sharpened. "Well, let's hope you always know your place," she murmured, sipping her wine. The words hung in the air like smoke. Tatum lowered her gaze, but her silence wasn't submission. It was grace, weaponized. Landon's hand tightened around his glass until a thin crack ran down the crystal, invisible except for the faintest sound, like a heartbeat under strain. Vanessa noticed. She leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Really, Landon," she said softly, "you keep such interesting company." He looked at her then, and the warmth drained from his gaze entirely. "Be careful, Vanessa," he said, voice even but laced with warning. "There's a fine line between elegance and cruelty." The room went quiet. Vanessa smiled, but her eyes flashed cold. Tatum excused herself soon after, her pulse quickened, but her dignity intact. From his seat, Landon watched her leave, the swing of her braid fading into the hall's shadows. He hadn't meant for the evening to unfold like this, but as Vanessa spoke again, light, careless chatter, he realized he no longer cared to protect appearances. The fracture in his glass was small, but it ran deep, and in the reflection of its broken edge, even he could see the truth. Something between them had already shifted, and there was no turning back. The house was unusually still that morning, the kind of stillness that followed the aftermath of words left hanging in the air. Tatum stood in the kitchen before sunrise, her apron folded neatly on the counter, the letter she'd written resting beside it. Her handwriting was careful, unshaken, though her heart hadn't been. The storm between the three of them, the dinner, the looks, the unspoken tension, had left its mark. Vanessa's smile still echoed in her mind, sharp as glass. Tatum wasn't going to stay where she was treated like an inconvenience. Pride demanded more than patience ever could. When Landon entered, he looked like a man already expecting loss. The faintest crease lined his brow, though his voice was steady. "You're leaving?" She nodded, avoiding his eyes. "It's for the best, Mr. Harrington." He picked up the letter. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should have. "Did Vanessa say something to you?" Her lips twitched, almost a smile. She didn't have to. The quiet stretched between them. He could have accepted it. Signed her final payment. Let her walk out the way she came in, professionally, politely, forgettably. It would have been easier, safer, but something in him rebelled against the silence. "Don't," he said finally. The word landed softly, as if he'd surprised himself by saying it. Tatum froze. She hadn't expected that. For a heartbeat, she let herself meet his gaze, and what she saw there unraveled the neat defenses she'd built around her heart. His eyes weren't commanding, they were pleading in a language he didn't know how to speak. "Please," he added quietly, almost under his breath. "Don't go." She looked away first, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. "This isn't my world, Landon," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts. "People like her will always see me as less. And you," she stopped, swallowing hard. "You won't correct them every time." His jaw tightened, not out of anger, but the kind of shame that comes with truth. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he would, but the words caught behind years of restraint. By the time he found them, she was already walking toward the door. "Tatum," he said, but it came out too late. When the door closed, the echo seemed to follow him through every corridor. That night, neither of them slept. Tatum lay awake, replaying his voice. Landon sat in his study, staring at her letter until dawn broke over the cliffs, realizing the house had gone quiet again. Only this time it wasn't peace he heard. It was absence. Rain fell again, the same kind that had once turned Waverly Hill into a blur of glass and sea, but this time there was no storm inside the house, just silence. 2 weeks had passed since Tatum left, and though the estate was as immaculate as ever, it no longer felt alive. The rhythm of footsteps in the hall was gone. The faint sound of humming that used to drift from the kitchen had vanished. Landon moved through each day with mechanical precision, but every polished surface seemed to reflect her absence back at him. The emptiness was unbearable precisely because it was his own making. He told himself she was fine, that people like Tatum always found a way to endure. But one evening, as he sifted through the day's mail, a message from the staffing agency slipped from an envelope, a condolence note forwarded to his address. "We were sorry to hear about Ms. Wells's mother." The words hit harder than he expected, a quiet punch to the chest. By the time he looked up, he was already reaching for his keys. The drive across town blurred past him in streaks of wet light. He didn't know what he would say, didn't plan what apology could possibly fit the distance between them. He only knew that he needed to see her. When he arrived, the building stood small and unassuming, its bricks darkened by rain. Her apartment light glowed faintly through a sheer curtain. He knocked once. When the door opened, Tatum stood there, eyes swollen and red, her face bare, stripped of the calm composure he remembered. She didn't speak. Neither did he. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people who had tried to forget and failed. The rain clung to his shoulders, running down his collar. "I heard about your mother," he said finally, his voice quieter than the rain. "I'm sorry." She nodded, tears filling her eyes again. "She was all I had." He took a hesitant step forward, then another. "No," he said softly. "You have me." The words weren't rehearsed. They escaped before reason could stop them. She shook her head, trying to look away, but his hand reached for hers, steady and certain. Their fingers touched, tentative, trembling, and something inside both of them broke open. The distance collapsed, and for the first time she let herself lean into him, grief and comfort entwined. He didn't promise forever. He didn't have to. In that quiet doorway, with rain whispering against the glass, the simple act of being seen was enough. When Tatum stepped through the doors of Waverly Hill again, it didn't feel like returning to work. It felt like crossing a threshold she couldn't uncross. The sea outside roared against the cliffs, and the wind carried the scent of rain and memory through the open foyer. Landon stood waiting at the top of the staircase, no longer the immaculate man she once served, but someone changed, softer at the edges, stripped of pretense. His eyes held that same look from her mother's funeral, unguarded, searching, real. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance that had once kept them safe now hung between them like a question neither could bear to answer. He moved first, slow and deliberate, his hand trailing along the banister as he descended. "You came back," he said, voice low, almost disbelieving. "I wasn't sure I would," she admitted. Her voice trembled, but her posture didn't. "But I realized leaving didn't make it hurt less." They stood a breath apart, Every unsaid word, every restrained glance from months past seemed to rise between them like ghosts finally demanding to be acknowledged. Landon reached out, fingers brushing her wrist, hesitant, reverent, afraid of crossing the line he'd drawn for so long. But she didn't pull away. "I tried not to see you," he said, his words barely more than a whisper. "Because the moment I did, I knew I wouldn't stop." Tatum smiled through the shimmer of tears, that quiet strength in her gaze returning like dawn breaking after too long a night. "Then stop pretending," she said softly. The distance vanished. His hand found her face, and she leaned into it without hesitation. Their first kiss wasn't rushed or desperate. It was slow, deliberate, full of everything they hadn't said. For the first time, the house felt alive again. The emptiness that had haunted its walls filled with something warmer, louder, the soft sound of laughter, of healing, of two hearts finally recognizing each other. Hay spent the evening in the study, firelight flickering across their faces, the photograph of Miriam still resting on the shelf. Tatum traced the frame with her fingers, smiling faintly. "She would have liked you," she said. Landon's voice softened. "She would have liked you more." Outside, the world still turned, indifferent to the quiet revolution inside those walls. But as the storm clouds gathered again beyond the cliffs, both knew peace wouldn't last. Love this unguarded didn't stay hidden for long, and the world beyond Waverly Hill was already waiting to test its truth. It began with a photograph, grainy, stolen, the kind of image that spreads faster than truth ever could. Landon and Tatum, walking through the courtyard at Waverly Hill, her head tilted toward him, sunlight catching the curve of her smile, his hand resting lightly at her back. A single moment, human and unguarded, turned into a headline that blazed across every screen. Billionaire and his maid. What the world saw as scandal, they felt as peace. But peace rarely survives exposure. By the end of the week, Vanessa's lawyers had called twice, each time with veiled threats disguised as courtesy. Board members sent carefully worded emails questioning his professional judgment. Journalists camped outside the gates, hungry for the fall of a man who had always seemed untouchable. Landon faced it all in silence at first, his expression unreadable as he read each message, each accusation. Tatum watched him from across the room, guilt pressing against her ribs even though she'd done nothing wrong. "I never meant to make your life harder," she said one night, voice soft, fingers twisting in her lap. He looked up from the screen, something fierce flickering behind his calm. "You didn't. You reminded me it was mine to live." The next morning, he did what no one expected. He didn't hide, didn't issue a statement or release a denial. Instead, he opened the gates of Waverly Hill, stepped into the waiting storm of cameras, and reached for her hand. His fingers laced through hers, steady and sure. Flashbulbs exploded like lightning, questions flew like daggers, but his voice, when he finally spoke, cut through the chaos. "Let them talk," he said, glancing at her, not the cameras. "I'm done living in rooms where you can't exist." Tatum blinked against the light, her chest tightening at the quiet conviction in his tone. The world might call it foolishness, rebellion, ruin, but to her, it looked like freedom. The kind of freedom her mother had once prayed she'd find, even if it came at a cost. In the months that followed, the noise faded, the board adapted, the whispers dulled. What endured was quieter. Their laughter at breakfast, their arguments over music, the rhythm of two lives that no longer needed permission to breathe. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, Tatum stood on the balcony, the wind tangling her hair. Landon came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She smiled, eyes closed, knowing at last that love didn't need to be justified or defended. It simply needed to be lived. Because some love stories don't ask to be accepted. They insist on being seen. If this story stayed with you, share it. Someone out there has been where Tatum stood, working in silence, seen but never truly seen, holding their dignity in a world that mistook it for obedience. They need to know that even the quietest hearts can rewrite the story. Comment below if you've ever been the one they looked past. until you became impossible to ignore. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.